Hi there everyone, it's me, your favorite Romanian region, and today I decided to make a video about the subject I haven't seen anyone else cover on YouTube. Not the stories of the characters in the game, those have been covered extensively in a million other videos, but of the world and the world building of We Happy Few. I want to make this video as a homage to this great game and make more people aware of the awesome world building. If that interests you, let's get started. The timeline of We Happy Few diverges from our own in 1933. 17 days before the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in office as President of the United States of America, Italian immigrant and anarchist Giuseppe Zangara successfully assassinates him by shooting him. In our own timeline, he shot 5 times and hit 5 different people, but he didn't manage to kill Roosevelt. In his place, your favorite Southern patriot Huey Long becomes president in 1939. He decides to keep the USA neutral in World War II, not only refusing to fight Germany, but denying aid to Great Britain. In Germany, it is implied that Hitler is killed, possibly in Verdun or in any other of his close encounters with death, and that he didn't get into power. Instead another nationalistic party takes over Germany, this time under the apparent rule of Erwin Rommel, German general that was member of Operation Valkyrie in our own timeline. There's also a less likely possibility that before the invasion of the USSR, Hitler gets killed and taken down from power in the aforementioned Operation Valkyrie. The flag used by Germany that we see is that of the German Empire, implying that the government is nationalistic and is trying to restore the glory of Germany. But it is quite clear that they are not the Nazis from our own timeline. In 1939, Germany, still having likely annexed Austria and Czechia, invades Poland, starting off World War II. Just like in our own timeline, Germany sweeps through the Low Countries and capitulates France in a short amount of time. Somewhere in 1942, Germany goes ahead with Operation Sea Lion, attempting to defeat Great Britain that after the fall of France continued to fight on. This invasion fails, with the Germans being pushed back into the sea, but in 1943 the Germans invade once again. This implies the Germans have some way of stopping or at least countering the Royal Navy. This time Britain is pushed back. London falls and the Germans quickly rush up the island, likely pushing to cities as north as Glasgow. Great Britain surrenders and is placed under German occupation. Either in late 1943 or in early 1944, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, wishing to eliminate the USSR as a possible threat to its hegemony over Europe. The first year goes well, with the Germans managing to get the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad and capturing Leningrad, likely with Finnish support. And to that I would like to add that in our own timeline, Leningrad could have been captured immediately by the Germans, but Hitler, making a dumb decision, decided to instead try to starve the city, which gave them just enough time to dig in and fight on and not capture Leningrad. Leningrad could have been captured on day 1 of Invasion Barbarossa in our own timeline if Hitler didn't make this blunder. Although I admit that his generals also made a lot of blunders, and he was the one to decide for his tanks to go through the forest in France, which his generals thought it was impossible. The US, seeing the threat Germany posed to the world and to its own future hegemony, decides to join the war on the side of the USSR and starts sending extensive economic and military aid to the USSR. It is likely that a winter offensive is launched, managing to push the German army back away from Moscow and Stalingrad and recapturing Leningrad, as you can see in this map. From now on, the Germans get pushed more and more into Europe, slowly. This is not mentioned anywhere in the game, but I personally like to believe that if the Germans were a bit less nationalistic and a bit less radical in World War II, they could have co-opted the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Baltics people, basically all the people that were under Stalin's subjugation to fight alongside the Nazis. They didn't even have to treat them well forever. They could have pretended they would treat them better than the communists, made them colonies after they won the war and then treat them badly. But no, instead they were ruthless them from the start, and they pushed any possible collaborator that they could have had back in the arms of Stalin. And so I like to think that that is also a reason why this war took 4 more years than in our own timeline. On the 8th of May 1947, the deadline to submit a new child registration to the German occupation authority in Great Britain arrives. On the 20th of July, the same year, there is orientation for the children to be sent to Germany. This attempt by the Germans to take the British people's kids to keep them in line and to make sure they don't revolt backfires, with all Britain except for Wellington and Wales rising up in revolt against their German occupiers. The Germans don't want to lose all of the gains that they have made in Britain, and so they fight savagely, using WMDs such as toxic gas and V1 rockets and bombings, and every weapon that they have at their disposal. This insurgency ultimately succeeds, pushing the Germans out of Britain. But in the process, the country is utterly devastated. We can see this effect in the Garden District. And while we can imagine that the rest of England is faring better than the Garden District, I wouldn't be imagining that it would be a lot prettier. On the 10th of August 1948, Soviet forces with help from the Americans captured Berlin. And in 1949, the Soviets captured the rest of Germany and all of France, with Ireland being apparently occupied by America, with the rest of England likely too devastated to be a member of the American faction. It is also seen that Spain gets invaded. Now, whether that is because they joined the German Axis in the crusade against communism from the start, or whether it is that Spain was still ruled by Franco but decided to remain neutral, like in our timeline, which I personally like to believe would be what would happen, just because Franco had some ridiculous demands and he didn't really offer a lot to the Axis in our own timeline. So if we follow the logic of our own timeline, what likely happened is that the Soviets used the existence of a fascist state in Europe, for Spain, as a justification to invade them. But this is what I would like to believe. We just know that they also get invaded. All of Europe, except for maybe Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and the British Isles, are under Soviet rule, with many people's republics being created in Europe. Now, while Sweden may not have been invaded like its occupied brother to the north, Norway, which was under German occupation, then was invaded by the Soviets together with Denmark, I think that pretty much all of Europe, if it's not under direct Soviet rule, it's at least under heavy scrutiny from Moscow. And thus likely Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden are either coerced to join the Comintern, or they are de facto members, with the Soviets being able to do whatever they want in their countries, maybe to position their armies there and so on. That's what I think. On the 3rd of March 1952, the first drug trials are successful, now being tested on humans, with our timeline arriving in the present in 1962, when the stories of all characters end, as well as the story of Wellington and Wales. Spoilers. It isn't specified whether Japan joins the war, but if the same system was in power as in our own timeline, it is likely that they were defeated by the Americans, since as much as people say that Japan was a fascist power, just like Germany, that simply wasn't true. Yes, they were authoritarian, nationalistic and so on, but they had a very weird system in which the generals would start wars, and then the politicians couldn't really stop the country from going to war with that country by trying to negotiate, because then they would be called cowards and they would be removed from power. And so this is how these wars started. The war with China was started by some generals originally. I'm talking about when they took Manchuria and Manchukuo. Some generals simply started a war with China, and then the politicians, not wishing to dishonor the country, went to war with China and established colonies there. This is also why there wasn't really an equivalent to the Nuremberg trials in Japan, because in Germany you had this clear group of Nazis that wanted to exterminate the Jews, that wanted to take control of all of Europe, maybe North Africa. But in our own timeline, you didn't really have that. You had some journalists that were unbelievably bad, and that you had some journals that were unbelievably bad, some that were less so. And so when you think of Japan in World War II, don't think of its part in politics as the same way as Germany, because they are really different, and I suggest you study it because it's really fascinating, the system that they had. Now, I assume that Japan also joins the war, but just like in our timeline, if we had an America that had a few more years not being at war and being able to build up its economy, Japan would either be defeated in 1945 the same way with the bombs, or since the USA didn't have to send 80% of its materials to Europe, would just be able to invade Japan in 1944, maybe early or mid 1944, and occupy them. Now, if the second variant is the one that is true to this timeline, well, then that is quite worrying, because if the Japanese don't surrender until the Americans fully invade them, it is likely they'll be so vengeful due to how many brothers and sisters they lost, that likely they would kill the royal family, which could lead to years and years and years of insurgency and resentment in Japan. But whatever happens, likely Japan is also under American occupation. Now, whether it still has its monarchy, it's up for debate. Now, you might be asking, so is England in the American faction? We don't think so, because what likely happened is that those children that were still sent to Germany, because some probably still arrived in Germany, were used as pawns by the Soviets to get England to be, if not neutral, then at least not overtly American aligned, with there being a map suggesting that there is a threat of invasion by the USSR. Now that we have arrived near the present, let's focus on the story of Wellington Wells, since from now the events from the world aren't really specified. Now, Wellington Wells is basically this set of islands connected by bridges that are in the Bristol Channels, or basically in the southwest of Wales, and they also have a bridge that connects them to the mainland, but that was cut in order to prevent people from escaping. Now, what you have to understand is that the original version of Joy was used by the German soldiers because it allowed them to fight without having to think about, their situation, about the fact that they might die any day, and so on. Now, the problem is that Wellington Wells is able to manufacture that kind of joy with the German ingredients they have left over for right now. The problem is that those German chemicals, those high quality German chemicals, are running out slowly but surely. And so over time what happens is that they have to slowly replace how much of these high quality German chemicals are used in order to make that limited supply last longer. The problem is that the newer Joy sometimes has these bad batches that can cause people to become downers, or basically to remember their past and not want to take joy again. While this is the case, it is also implied that if you are exposed too much time, too many years to bad batches of joy, or just to average joy, not high quality German joy, that can make you joy intolerant, like Ollie. Ollie, if he consumes joy, he throws up. He cannot support this version of Joy. And the problem is that the newer Joy also has the effect of making people kind of retarded, or not really retarded, but very incompetent and not able to work really well. The German Joy did not have this side effect. It was German, so of course it was of higher quality, because everything from Germany is higher quality. Now what you have to understand is that now in 1960, in a DLC called They Came From Below, Dr. Faraday creates a portal to a planet X, and it's a long story and I don't want to really spoil it, but to keep it short, what we think happened is that after her former subordinates betray her and they give her over to the aliens, what we think happened is that the alien robots wiped their minds clean of these events and probably locked or destroyed this portal they made towards their planet X, in order to make sure that if they were contacted again in the future, they would have the time to heal themselves, and maybe for the humans that contact them to be more prepared for this kind of contact with alien species. Another consequence of this was that motolin crystals would begin to grow in Wellington Wells' mind. These crystals would later be shortened to simply motolin. Now this motolin was a replacement for petrol, which, considering the isolated state of Wellington Wells, we can assume they didn't have much of. And so this motolin can be used now in order to fuel their society. Originally I thought that motolin was used in the production of Joy, which in some cases I think it might be, but for the most part that's not the case, no. It needs certain chemicals. Now another problem is due to all the bad batches of Joy and the new Joy without high quality German chemicals, the workers become more ineffective and more mindless. This means that the infrastructure that allows the transport of motolin and its use throughout the underground tunnels under the cities, which go all around, are beginning to break down. The fundamental infrastructure that is allowing these cities to survive is breaking down. And now in Arthur's story, we see that in the span of about 3 or 4 weeks, it just blows up. Everything gets destroyed. This network that allows the transport of motolin energy throughout the city gets more and more degraded. And the problem is that when one part of this system blows up, it causes the other systems to get closer towards also blowing up. And so it kind of causes a chain reaction that destroys this whole system. Now let's talk about the final collapse of Wellington Wells. So in Arthur's story, we see that the motolin supply and the fundamental infrastructure of the city is destroyed. It is destroyed due to degradation and due to mismanagement. In Sally's story, we see that Wellington Wells doesn't really able to innovate as much. Really, the only people who create stuff here are Dr. Faraday and Sally. When they disappear, it all collapses. And the third thing I would like to mention is in Ollie's story, he puts Uncle Jack's final recording on, telling people that they need to stop taking the joy, that it is the end. Now another thing that I would like to point out is that it is likely that Uncle Jack was collaborated under the Germans, and we can notice that in his records. And in the last update of We Happy Few, we actually get a DLC playing as Miss Being after she gets taken away from Joy by Ollie. And we see what finally happens to this. And in this DLC, we finally see all these 3 factors converging and slowly destroying the city. Now Miss Being of her joy realizes that Wellington Wells cannot survive for very long if he doesn't take drastic action. But her father, General Being, and Dr. Verloc have a certain uninterested attitude or selfish attitude. Her father says that he has a vault in which he has a year's supply of food, which he does. And Dr. Verloc is like, well, even if 90% of them die and we only have 10% of the population left, that will be easier to be fed. Which horrifies Miss Being and causes her to go into a mission to stop the use of joy. First, she attacks the pumps which allow for the transport of joy throughout the booths that we see, and thus people are no longer able to take joy from their booths. After she does this, she remembers that she herself suggested that joy be put in water so that whenever people drank water, they would also be drinking joy. And thus she also goes on to destroy the system that spreads joy in the water system. Now after this, she gets put in prison, to keep it short, but she gets her jail door opened by her father. Now basically she just goes on to destroy Verloc's lab, which basically means that there is no chance of ever producing joy in a significant quantity again, at least in Wellington Wells. And we see that the city is well and truly in ruins, burning. From now on in this video, everything that I'll be saying will be either really speculative or fully speculative based on what I think would happen and the spare information we have available. Now, there is a theory which suggests that there might have been a small nuclear exchange between the US and the USSR. There isn't much evidence to back this theory except for a line from a Bobby saying that it was unusually cold for this time of year. And while this apocalypse would severely affect the rest of the world, since it would likely destroy essential societal infrastructure in the US and the USSR spheres, thus causing maybe not a societal end, but a societal breakdown into smaller and smaller groups of people trying to survive and scrounge a small life over here. But the thing is that if this happened, Wellington Wells would be so isolated, it wouldn't really affect them, except for the fact that they would now be dealing with lowered crop yields. That's another subject I'd like to address. So did Wellington Wells stop producing food altogether? Well, no, it was more of a process with the farmers getting sick of not being treated well and slowly giving up on farming and maybe going back to the cities or fleeing Wellington Wells. This would also make sense considering that why would Americans, English or Soviet peoples accept the existence of such a dystopian state right in their backyards? Like, Wellington Wells doesn't have a military. It has an ever-shrinking population and an aging society. And so, if someone invaded, there wasn't much they could do to stop them. Another theory is that what we see right now is the Soviets implementing a model system in England. If this is true, then England would be under Soviet rule, and what we see is an experiment to make England a model socialist country using social manipulation by using these drugs. Now, the last subject I would like to cover before I move on to the possible future of this world is talking about what happened to the children of Wellington Wells. What is that all about? Alright, so basically what happened is that the Germans wanted Brits to send all children that were under the age of 14 to Germany. Of course, this didn't work in Britain, but Wellington Wells was the one that was cowered into doing this. Now the Germans, to intimidate the citizens, put close to the city a bunch of tanks, which were likely at first real ones, but as the situations for Germany deteriorated on the Eastern Front, it is likely that they replaced the real tanks with papier-mâché tanks, with help from General Byng likely. Now you might be wondering, so what happened to the children? Well, we don't know. We just don't. Some people say that they died on a train, or that they are still under the rule, or that they are still in Germany under the rule of the Soviets. But the thing is that it's probably a mixed fate. Like probably some died on the train, probably some were killed in the savageness of war, probably some were put in camps, probably some died due to malnutrition, and there are even theories suggesting that the Germans might have eaten the children since they also were dealing with a famine, but I do think that is just propaganda at work over there, because I do think that is a bit exaggerated even for this world. Now, if you played the game, you might be wondering, why were those people that tried to destroy the registry of children that would be sent over to Germany hanged by the citizens? The Germans did not order the city to do this, they just decided to. Why did they do it? Well, it was a combination of guilt and trying to protect some kind of honor. Like, think about it this way. Let's say you are a citizen of Wellington, Wales, that voluntarily sent over your children because you're afraid that the Germans would do bad things to you if you didn't. Now imagine you see these people that are trying to prevent their children to be sent over to Germany. How can these people dare to do this? I am saving this city by having sent my children. How dare they do this? I will force them to do this because I will not have our fate be decided by some selfish bastard. And so it is a combination of both guilt and some kind of self-righteousness. Another interesting fact I'd like to cover are breeder riots, which are basically these riots in which if any woman was found to be pregnant, she would be killed by the people of the city. Now the reason why this happened was probably for the same reason of self-righteousness and guilt towards sending their own children and not wishing to see other people having children. And so, to be honest, even if Wellington Wells didn't collapse due to its infrastructure blowing up or due to joy going rot and becoming less and less good in quality, they would have collapsed inevitably due to the lack of children, due to lack of a new generation take their place. Because think about it, the youngest people that exist when the Germans tried to take the children away would have been 14. By the end of the game in 1962, it's like these would be in their early 20s or late 20s. And so it would mean that as time goes on, you'd have more dependents to take care of and less productive young people, which would inevitably lead to the social collapse of Wellington Well. Alright, so this part of the video is actually going to be focusing on the possible future of the world considering the limited facts that we know. First thing I'm going to say, I believe that in this timeline, the Kuomintang would win in China, because one of the reasons why they lost in our timeline was because the Soviets gave over Manchuria to the communist forces as a refugee in which they could regroup and reorganize. But since the Soviets would always prioritize their western heartlands, which were being invaded by the Germans, they would probably not have enough resources to send over to the communist forces to actually help them. So I believe that in this timeline, China would be under the rule of the nationalists. Now what I believe would happen is that, like in our timeline with Taiwan, I believe China would be under the dictatorship of the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, but with a lot more economic liberties. And after his death, I believe China would begin a slow maybe faster, maybe slower process towards democratization. Now what I would like to say is that in our own timeline, the Communist Party, the CCP, took a dumb decision to limit the number of babies that the people of China could have to 1. This collapsed their birth rates before they managed to fully industrialize or to develop. And so it means that by 2050 their population will literally be cut in half. Thus meaning that right now in our world we have a scenario in which China is going, over the next decade or two, is going to become more powerful than America, and then, just like Russia, it's going to collapse due to its demographic structure. This in our timeline puts the world at risk, since it means that China would either attack this decade or in the early 2030s, otherwise they just lose due to their demographic structure, while the USA, even with all its problems, would likely continue to be a stable quarter of the world GDP. In this timeline, where China is under the nationalists and slowly democratizes and hopefully doesn't collapses, I believe that by the 21st century, by the start of it, China would be, if not the world superpower, then close to being the most powerful nation in the world, economically and militarily and so on. Because they would probably have a population close to 2 billion that would have had an extra 40 years of economic development without restriction from the Communist Party. Imagine how powerful that would be. The appearance of communism in the USSR and China is the best thing that could have possibly happened to America due to it handicapping their societies. Now, as I said, Japan is probably still under the occupation of America, and whether they kill the royal family and that leads to a lot of animosity between their two peoples, I don't think matters that much. Just like in our own timeline, there's probably still an economic boom that creates a powerful Western ally in Asia. Now with Japan and China under the leadership of America, this basically means that the Vietnam War also is won by the Western aligned government. And if this is the truth, then it also means that Korea is also unified under the German Republic, which, yeah, I know, was an anti-communist dictatorship that eventually became a democracy. Now, just like in our own timeline, I would like to think India remains neutral, since it had really strong socialist alignings or tendencies, and so I think they will stay neutral just like in our own timeline. You might be thinking, what is the situation with Africa? Now, I think Africa right now is splintered in hundreds of groups that are fighting over different interests, ideologies, and access to different resources. So Africa right now is likely a mess of American aligned, Soviet aligned, and just neutral countries trying to survive in a ravaged continent. Now, what would be the future of Europe? Personally, I think that even though this USSR might seem stronger, it might collapse even earlier than in our own timeline. The reason I believe that is pretty simple. Think about our own timeline. The USSR lost 25 million people in our own timeline, and that is having horrific ramifications for the Russian demographics right now. One of the reasons why Russia is invading Ukraine, besides others, is to secure itself before it goes into a demographic collapse just like China. And a reason why it's having such big problems is due to so many young people that would have had otherwise children being killed in World War II. Now, considering they had to fight Germany and the Axis one-on-one with pretty much no external American help, like them invading Europe, I think that they could take as much as 30, 35, 40 million casualties, maybe even more, because they had to push through literally all of Europe all the way into Spain. And so I believe that the population structure will be even more messed up in this timeline. And so I believe that whether it is in 1970, 1980, 1990, by the 2000s, I think the Soviet faction have collapsed. Now, when you look at all post-Soviet countries, including my country Romania, you see that in every single one of them, the population rate collapses while the population is still pretty poor. This is true in almost all communist countries. And thus you would see a Europe that is having even more demographic collapses than in our own timeline. Now, I don't know what would happen post-Soviet collapse. Just like in our own timeline, you'd probably see some countries joining the American sphere of influence, some countries joining the Russian sphere of influence. But I don't know how America would really take over the continent, because without a foothold in which to establish its capitalist system, it would probably be pretty hard to convince these countries to really join the American system. Another thing that comes to mind is that Ireland and Scotland would probably be the richest countries in the world. Ireland even more so, because in this timeline any resources that would have been allocated for the Marshall Plan would have likely gone into making Ireland and Scotland strong capitalist democracies. Now, South America, I don't really think it's any different from our own. The same. CIA coups, America having massive influence over the region, so I think it's basically the same. In North America, the only thing I could imagine is different is that the people of America wouldn't really have had a baby boomer generation. I think the West in general would be a lot more racist, because one of the reasons why America went in one generation from being, pretty damn racist to being not really that racist is because of the baby boomers' wealth. The baby boomers being able to sell their products to Europe and to Asia made them unbelievably rich, and because of that they were able to think, if all men are created equal, why not blacks? Why not gays? If we are a democracy, why don't we? And this basically meant that America, along with the Western world, became some of the least racist countries in the world, as much as people like to say otherwise. Now, for people that will say that it's just Western propaganda, it's not. Like, go to China. They're literally committing genocide right now of other races that they see as being inferior to theirs or too rebellious. Like, as much as people complain, Western civilization is the best, even if right now it's degenerated. Now, to end this video off, because now what would be the differences between our world and this world, where, as I just mentioned, it'd be more racist, since you wouldn't have had a rich baby boomer generation that is able to really question their ethics and realize the inconsistencies of their ideology. Another thing that would be very different is that Europe would be in even worse demographic shape than in our own timeline. I don't know if there would be a migrant crisis, I'm not really sure about that, because that was kind of caused by America destabilizing the region in order to make sure that there was no competitor made to the petrodollar. Oh yeah, that's also something I'd like to mention. Basically, the reason America invaded Libya, Syria and Iraq is because they tried to sell their oil either in a new African currency like Libya tried, or selling it in euros, which would have severely threatened the petrodollar, which basically allows the Americans to export their inflation to the rest of the world. And we can't really do anything, because if we want to get petrol or oil from Saudi Arabia, for example, we need to buy it in American dollars, which means that America is basically able to spend way more money than it normally would. And since they are off the gold standard, it just means that they export their inflation, as I just said, and there isn't much we can do. There is also a reason why I think a lot of countries are taking up renewable energy, not necessarily because they give a single fuck about the environment, but in order to end the American petrodollar, which has remained in existence since like 1945 with the agreements between Saudi Arabia and America. Another thing is that China would be unbelievably powerful. If China manages to grow economically just like in our own timeline with more liberal policies, this would mean that by the 2000s, as I just said, China would be a juggernaut, probably close to a population of 2 billion, a massive economy likely bigger than America, and a quickly growing middle class. And it is likely that the 21st century would actually be the Chinese century. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. See you next time. Hey there, if you like this video don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I put quite a lot of work into these videos and I hope you enjoy them. See you! Sacul legat în spate cu armele în mâini, fie din cu